Dearest listeners, before we lose ourselves in the shadows of London and the quiet desperation of an impoverished earl's daughter, do signal your approval of our chronicle with a like, and if you wish to witness how true nobility is forged, not by birth, but by fire, subscribe now. For today, your humble chronicler brings you the most rending tale of a marriage forged in desperation, a year of silence that shattered hearts, and the bitter transformation of a lady who learned that survival required becoming someone entirely new. But let us not rush, for the best stories, like the finest wrought steel, must be hammered, hardened, and savored properly. The spring of 1818 found Lady Catherine Willowmore standing at the rain-streaked window of the Willowmore townhouse in Brook Street, contemplating the particular cruelty of being born beautiful in an age when beauty alone could not satisfy creditors. At 22, she had become her family's final asset, the last desperate hope for salvation from ruin that crept closer with each passing day. Her father, the Earl of Kendrick, had retreated into his study with increasing permanence, a bottle of claret his most constant companion. The shipping investments that had promised fortune had instead delivered catastrophe, dragging the family from comfortable prosperity into genteel poverty that grew less genteel by the month. The Lincolnshire estate operated at a loss. The London townhouse showed its shabbiness despite her mother's frantic efforts at concealment. Two younger sisters, Marianne at 18 and Eleanor at 15, waited for presentations to society that could not occur unless Catherine succeeded in the essential duty of marrying wealth. Catherine understood her situation with painful clarity. She possessed the advantages nature had granted: chestnut hair that caught light like autumn leaves, gray eyes that gentlemen termed luminous, a figure that required no corseting to achieve fashionable silhouette. Yet these attributes had attracted only fortune-hunting younger sons and one particularly persistent merchant whose grandfather's India trade had elevated the family to questionable respectability. Her father had rejected every proposal with the wounded pride of a man who had not yet accepted that circumstances had altered irrevocably. The Earl insisted his eldest daughter would marry rank equal to or surpassing his own, or she would remain unwed. This position might have been admirable had their creditors been less aggressive. The season stretched ahead like an obligation rather than an opportunity. Catherine would smile until her face ached, dance with gentlemen who knew precisely how desperate her situation had become, and pretend the whispers did not penetrate her carefully maintained composure. Gossip circulated through the tea rooms and gentlemen's clubs with the efficiency of a plague, and the knowledge of the Willowmore collapse was the latest delicacy served in the salons. Her mother entered without knocking, carrying a gown of pale blue muslin that had been turned and retrimmed so many times the fabric had begun to surrender. The Countess of Kendrick laid the garment across Catherine's bed with exaggerated care, treating this pathetic thing as though it were precious. She informed her daughter that they would attend the Marchioness of Hartley's ball that evening, and Catherine would wear this dress with the family sapphires, paste replicas for 3 years now, though her mother maintained the fiction, and she would be pleasant and agreeable without appearing desperate. Catherine merely inclined her head, the final gesture of a queen abdicating. Arguing accomplished nothing save distressing all parties involved. As afternoon progressed toward evening, Catherine submitted to her lady's maid's ministrations with passive cooperation. Martha had been with the family since Catherine's childhood, possessing skills with hair that deserved far better compensation than the Willowmores could provide. The girl worked in determined silence, creating an arrangement of curls and combs that transformed Catherine from merely pretty into something approaching remarkable. When Catherine descended the stairs, her father emerged from his study long enough to observe that she did the family credit. This represented high praise from a man who had retreated so far into disappointment that he barely noticed his surroundings. Her sisters embraced her with enthusiastic affection and made her promise to remember every detail for later recounting. The modest carriage, hired by the hour, which was a humiliating sign of their decline, deposited them at the Marchioness of Hartley's residence, which blazed with light against the warm May evening. Music and laughter spilled from open windows. Catherine steeled herself for the ordeal ahead, arranging her features into an expression of serene contentment that concealed the anxiety churning in her stomach. The ballroom glittered with hundreds of candles reflected in gilt mirrors and crystal chandeliers. Ladies in silks and satins created a moving rainbow, whilst gentlemen in severe black evening dress provided elegant contrast. The air smelled of beeswax, perfume, and the peculiar scent of ambition that permeated all such gatherings during the season. Catherine recognized the usual collection of eligible gentlemen: Lord Hartwell, whose breath suggested fondness for spirits; Sir Thomas Beckworth, pleasant enough, but cursed with 6 unmarried sisters; the Honourable Mr. Fitzwilliam, who had proposed to half the young ladies in London and been refused by all. None represented salvation. Her mother secured them positions near the wall where they might observe without appearing too eager. The Countess nodded to various acquaintances whilst maintaining the fiction that they attended for pleasure rather than desperate necessity. Catherine smiled and returned greetings and pretended not to notice the pitying glances or speculative whispers. Then he appeared. Edmund Ashford, Duke of Silvermere, stood at the far end of the ballroom, and the very air around him seemed to shimmer with consequence. Even from a distance, Catherine recognized the bearing of significant rank. His evening dress had been cut by a master tailor, his cravat achieved perfection without ostentation, and he moved with the unconscious confidence of a man accustomed to being the most important person in any room. The whispers began immediately, rustling through the assembly like wind through autumn leaves. The Duke had returned to London after years of rural isolation following his father's sudden death. Speculation ignited regarding his intentions. Surely he must be seeking a wife. Catherine observed him covertly, whilst pretending interest in the dancers. The Duke possessed features that might have been termed severe: strong jaw, prominent cheekbones, a mouth more accustomed to frowning than smiling, yet somehow combined into something approaching handsomeness. His hair showed dark brown with threads of premature gray at the temples. His eyes, even at distance, appeared remarkably blue. She noticed the way he listened with genuine attention when Lord Hartley spoke, the slight tension in his shoulders suggesting discomfort with the crowded ballroom, the manner in which his gaze occasionally swept the assembly as though searching for something specific. Catherine did not imagine for one moment that such a gentleman would notice her existence. Dukes did not pursue daughters of impoverished earls when they could have their pick of celebrated beauties attached to impressive dowries. She simply appreciated him as one might appreciate a fine painting, something beautiful to admire without expectation of possession. Therefore, when Lord Hartley began progressing through the crowd in her direction with the Duke at his side, Catherine assumed they moved towards some other destination and prepared to step aside. Lord Hartley stopped directly before her. The Baron executed introductions with the satisfaction of a man facilitating something significant. His words flowed past Catherine in a blur of titles and pleasantries, whilst her mind struggled to comprehend the reality unfolding. The Duke of Silvermere inclined his head with perfect courtesy and requested the honor of her next dance. Her mother made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Catherine managed to accept with creditable composure despite the sudden acceleration of her heartbeat. Her hand trembled only slightly as she placed it in his offered one. The orchestra had begun a waltz. The Duke guided her onto the floor with practiced ease, positioning them amongst the other couples with precision of a gentleman well versed in such activities despite his years of rural isolation. His hand settled at her waist with appropriate delicacy. Her fingers rested on his shoulder. They began to move, and Catherine discovered that Edmund Ashford danced beautifully. Neither spoke initially, adhering to that peculiar convention which held that conversation during a waltz should commence only after the third rotation. Catherine used this interval to study him more closely while striving to maintain proper posture and follow his lead without appearing either too eager or too reserved. Up close, he appeared older than his 32 years. Lines bracketed his mouth and creased the corners of his eyes, marks of either excessive worry or excessive responsibility. Catherine suspected both. His expression remained carefully neutral, revealing nothing of his thoughts or emotions. His hands bore no rings save his signet, and his fingers showed calluses, evidence that he did not fear honest labor, a rarity that suddenly seemed to her the promise of a solid foundation, unlike the luxury her father's dissolution had revealed to be a delusion. When he finally spoke, his voice emerged deeper than she anticipated, with a slight roughness that suggested either recent illness or chronic disuse of social pleasantries. The Duke apologized for his presumption in requesting an introduction without proper intermediaries beyond Lord Hartley. He explained that he had been observing her from across the room and found himself compelled to make her acquaintance through whatever means presented themselves. Catherine responded with something appropriately modest whilst her mind reeled with implications. A duke did not cross a ballroom to secure introduction to an unremarkable young lady unless motivated by genuine interest. Yet what could possibly interest such a gentleman about her? Her family possessed nothing he could want. Her dowry consisted of paste jewelry and mounting debts. Her connections, whilst respectable, offered no particular advantage to a man of his standing. He inquired about her family with what seemed authentic curiosity rather than mere politeness. She provided carefully edited responses that acknowledged her father's earldom without detailing their financial collapse. Years of practice had taught her to discuss the Lincolnshire estate as though it remained a functioning agricultural enterprise rather than a drain on non-existent resources. The Duke mentioned his own properties in Leicestershire and Somerset, speaking of his tenants with an affection that surprised Catherine. Gentlemen of rank rarely considered those beneath them as anything more than economic units producing rents. Yet Edmund Ashford described improvements he had implemented to cottages and schools with the pride of a man who measured success in tenant welfare rather than mere profit extraction. She found herself warming to him despite her better judgment. The Duke possessed none of the practiced charm that characterized most gentlemen pursuing matrimony. Instead, he offered something more valuable and infinitely rarer: sincerity. He spoke to her as though her opinions mattered, as though her thoughts deserved consideration. When she ventured a comment about agricultural reform, a topic she had studied from necessity, given her father's spectacular mismanagement, he responded with enthusiasm rather than the condescension she typically encountered when daring to discuss masculine concerns. The waltz concluded far too quickly. The Duke returned her to her mother with obvious reluctance and a request for permission to call upon them the following afternoon. The Countess agreed with such fervent enthusiasm that Catherine felt herself blush with second-hand embarrassment. Throughout the remainder of the evening, Catherine danced with other gentlemen and participated in appropriate conversation whilst her thoughts remained fixed on the Duke of Silvermere. She replayed every moment of their waltz, analyzing each word and gesture for hidden meaning. Surely she had misinterpreted his interest. Surely reality would reassert itself come morning, revealing this as merely a duke's passing whim rather than genuine regard. Yet when the carriage finally bore them home in the small hours and she climbed the stairs to her chamber, she allowed herself the dangerous luxury of hope. Perhaps Providence had not entirely abandoned the Willowmores. Perhaps their salvation walked in the form of a grave-faced duke with unexpectedly gentle hands and eyes that looked at her as though she represented something precious. She sat rigidly on the edge of the bed, too exhausted to bear the task of unfastening the row of buttons on her back, waiting for Martha's arrival. The Duke called precisely at 3 o'clock the following afternoon, demonstrating a promptness that both flattered and unnerved Catherine. Her mother had spent the morning in a frenzy of preparation, attempting to make their drawing room appear less shabby through strategic arrangement of furniture and flowers purchased with funds they could ill afford to spend. Her father had been persuaded to emerge from his study and present himself as a functioning earl rather than a defeated recluse nursing his disappointments in solitude. Edmund Ashford entered their home with the ease of a man who either did not notice its deterioration or chose to ignore it with the tact of someone well-bred. He brought no ostentatious gifts, no flowers or bonbons designed to overwhelm through expense. Instead, he carried only himself and his attention, which he devoted entirely to Catherine with an intensity that left her breathless and slightly terrified. They conversed for the prescribed 30 minutes under her mother's watchful supervision, discussing topics both significant and trivial, with the careful dance of two people assessing mutual suitability. The Duke revealed an unexpected wit that manifested through dry observations rather than obvious humor. Catherine discovered she could make him smile, a transformation that softened his severe features into something approaching warmth, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. When he departed, he requested permission to call again on the morrow. Her father granted it with the barely concealed desperation of a drowning man grasping at rescue. Thus began a courtship unlike anything Catherine had imagined possible in her circumstances. The Duke called daily, sometimes taking her driving in Hyde Park during the fashionable hour when all of society could observe their growing attachment. Other times, he appeared at balls and soirees where they danced and conversed with the intensity of two people discovering unexpected kinship in a world that usually offered only superficial connection. Edmund, for he had requested she use his Christian name during private moments, a liberty that thrilled her beyond all reasonable proportion, proved himself a man of fascinating contradictions. He possessed vast wealth, yet lived simply, eschewing the ostentation many of his rank considered necessary. He commanded significant political influence, yet avoided using it for personal advantage, preferring to work quietly for causes he believed just. He moved through society with ducal authority, yet maintained an underlying gentleness that emerged during unguarded moments, particularly when discussing his late mother or his tenants' children. Catherine found herself falling in love with terrifying velocity, tumbling headlong into attachment despite knowing the dangers such feeling represented. She loved the way he listened when she spoke, truly listened rather than merely awaiting his turn to contribute. She loved his hands, strong and capable, whether holding reins or teacup with equal competence. She loved the rare smile that transformed his entire countenance from austere to approachable. She loved his unexpected vulnerability when discussing his father's death and the burden of responsibilities assumed too young, at 24, when he should have had decades more to prepare. Most dangerously, she loved the way he looked at her, as though she represented something precious and irreplaceable rather than a convenient solution to the marriage mart's tedious demands. The Tun noticed, naturally. Speculation ran rampant regarding the Duke's intentions. Betting books at White's listed odds on when he would propose and whether the impoverished Willowmore chit had somehow entrapped one of England's most eligible bachelors through means both fair and potentially foul. Some whispered she had employed arts learned from her mother, who had been considered something of a beauty in her youth. Others suggested the Duke had simply taken leave of his senses after too many years of rural isolation. Catherine tried not to hear these whispers, tried to exist purely in the moments they shared without considering what might happen should his interest prove temporary. Yet fear lived permanently in her chest, a cold weight that no amount of reassurance could fully dispel. Her mother existed in a state of barely controlled hysteria, alternating between ecstatic planning of trousseau details and anxious warnings about proper behavior. The Countess reminded Catherine daily that she must not presume, must not push, must allow the Duke to proceed at his own pace, lest she frighten him away with inappropriate expectations. These admonitions only increased Catherine's anxiety, transforming each encounter into a test she feared failing through some inadvertent misstep. Her father emerged from his depression sufficiently to investigate the Duke's finances and connections with the thoroughness of a man who had learned expensive lessons about trusting appearances. The Earl discovered nothing objectionable. Edmund Ashford managed his estates responsibly, lived well within his considerable means, maintained no mistresses in keeping, gambled only moderately at clubs, and possessed a reputation for integrity that bordered on the unusual among the aristocracy, where casual dishonesty was often considered merely sophisticated. Catherine's sisters adored him instantly and without reservation. Eleanor declared him the most romantic figure imaginable, whilst Marianne appreciated his willingness to discuss topics beyond fashion and the latest on dits circulating through drawing rooms. During one particularly memorable call, he spent 20 minutes helping Eleanor with her watercolors, demonstrating techniques with patient instruction that revealed unexpected artistic knowledge and genuine kindness toward a girl young enough to be tedious. As spring progressed toward summer with that peculiar acceleration the season always seemed to possess, Catherine allowed herself to believe with increasing conviction. Edmund's constancy suggested genuine attachment rather than passing fancy born of boredom or whim. He introduced her to his closest friends, a small circle of gentlemen he had known since Cambridge days. He presented her to his great-aunt, the formidable Dowager Duchess of Westhaven, whose approval carried significant weight in the highest circles. He spoke of his Leicestershire estate with the implicit suggestion that she might someday see it, might someday belong there. They spent an afternoon at Hatchard's, where he insisted on purchasing several volumes she admired, despite her protests about expense and propriety. They attended the opera, where he had secured the family Silvermere box, and spent the performance alternately watching the stage and watching her with equal attention, as though her reactions interested him as much as the Italian soprano's renowned technique. They rode together in Hyde Park as dawn broke over London, an improper hour that thrilled Catherine with its intimacy and casual disregard for convention that usually governed every moment of their interaction. During one of these dawn rides, when morning mist still clung to the Serpentine and no other riders had yet appeared to observe and report their activities, Edmund reined his horse beside hers and spoke with uncharacteristic hesitation. He told her that he had not expected to find what he had found in her. He confessed that he had come to London reluctantly, driven by his aunt's insistence and vague sense of duty rather than any genuine desire to rejoin society he had abandoned. He admitted that meeting her had changed something fundamental in his understanding of what his life might become, had opened possibilities he had thought closed to him permanently after his father's death, had transformed him from carefree young man into duke burdened with enormous responsibilities. Catherine's heart expanded until she thought it might burst from her chest, spilling emotion too large to be contained. She responded with equal honesty, revealing her own surprise at the depth of feeling he had awakened in her, confessing that she had not believed herself capable of the kind of connection they seemed to share. They sat there in the quiet morning, horses shifting restlessly beneath them, and shared a moment of perfect understanding that required no additional words. He reached across the space between their mounts and took her hand with deliberate intent. The gesture violated every rule of propriety, yet Catherine did not withdraw. His fingers closed around hers with gentle pressure, and she felt the calluses she had noted during their first waltz. They remained thus for several heartbeats, connected across empty air by clasped hands and mutual hope that perhaps, against all odds, they had found something rare and valuable. In that moment, she realized that hope, once lost, was the most dangerous commodity of all. It made her, again, a hostage to circumstance. Then Edmund released her, straightened in his saddle with visible effort, and suggested they return before the park grew crowded with the fashionable set who rose at more conventional hours. As they rode back toward Mayfair through streets beginning to stir with morning activity, Catherine wrapped that moment around herself like a talisman against future uncertainty. The courtship continued with stately inevitability that seemed to satisfy even the most cynical observers. Catherine began discreetly selecting fabrics for her trousseau despite the absence of an official proposal, reasoning that preparation would save time once Edmund made his intentions formally known. Her mother consulted with their mantua maker about wedding gowns, discussing designs in whispered conferences that pretended Catherine could not hear every word. Her father emerged from his fog sufficiently to discuss marriage settlements with his solicitor, preparing for negotiations he assumed imminent, and praying they might extract terms generous enough to save the family from complete ruin. The season reached its zenith as June arrived with unseasonable heat that made ballrooms stifling, despite all windows thrown open to admit whatever breeze might exist. Invitations multiplied to such an extent that Catherine's mother required a separate book to track their social obligations and ensure they attended every event where the Duke might appear. Edmund and Catherine were observed together at every significant gathering, their courtship progressing with a rhythm that suggested certainty even without formal declaration. Yet subtle changes began to manifest that Catherine noticed with growing unease. Edmund grew distracted during their conversations, his attention wandering to concerns he would not share despite her gentle inquiries. He canceled 2 scheduled drives with apologies that felt perfunctory rather than genuine. During a ball at Devonshire House, she observed him in intense conversation with a gentleman she did not recognize. Their discussion apparently heated enough to draw curious glances from others nearby. When she asked about this stranger, Edmund dismissed her concern with vague explanation about estate business requiring attention. He lamented that certain obligations that affected the very foundation of his house required his immediate focus. His tone discouraged further questions, and Catherine reluctantly subsided, despite instincts screaming that something had changed. Some shadow had fallen across their previously sunny courtship. The following week brought more concerning developments. Edmund failed to appear for a morning call without sending prior notice or subsequent apology. When Catherine encountered him at Lady Sefton's musical that evening, he seemed haggard, lines of strain deepening around his eyes and mouth. He danced with her as protocol demanded, but with mechanical precision rather than the attention that had characterized their previous interactions. Catherine asked directly if something troubled him, if she had somehow given offense, or if circumstances had altered his feelings toward her. Edmund assured her that nothing had changed in his regard, that he simply faced complicated matters requiring his focus, that she must trust him to manage certain difficulties without explanation. This response satisfied her mother, who counseled patience and understanding. It did not satisfy Catherine, who had developed sufficient sense of Edmund's character to recognize genuine distress beneath his careful reassurances. Yet she possessed no right to demand explanations, no claim that entitled her to his confidence beyond what he chose freely to share. They were not engaged. She was not his wife. She remained merely a lady he had courted with apparent serious intent, but to whom he owed nothing beyond basic courtesy. The realization of her powerlessness settled like lead in her stomach. 2 days later, a note arrived at Brook Street delivered by Edmund's footman. The missive, brief to the point of curtness, stated that the Duke would be unable to call that afternoon as previously arranged. Business required his immediate attention. He would contact her when circumstances permitted. Catherine read the note thrice, searching for warmth or reassurance and finding neither. The phrasing suggested dismissal rather than temporary postponement. She showed it to her mother, who paled visibly before insisting it meant nothing, that gentlemen often had urgent matters demanding attention, that Catherine must not read excessive meaning into simple scheduling changes. Her father, summoned to provide masculine perspective, studied the note with the expression of a man recognizing disaster. The Earl observed that this communication bore hallmarks of a gentleman preparing to extricate himself from entanglement. He suggested Catherine prepare herself for disappointment, whilst hoping his assessment proved incorrect. Catherine spent that night lying awake, staring at her chamber ceiling and trying to understand what had gone wrong. She reviewed every conversation, analyzed every interaction, searched for the moment when she had erred fatally and driven away the man who had seemed so sincerely attached. She found nothing conclusive, yet somehow remained convinced the fault lay with her. She had been too eager, too presumptuous, too willing to believe a duke might genuinely wish to marry an impoverished earl's daughter. The following day brought no further communication, nor the day after that, nor the week that followed. Catherine maintained her social schedule with grim determination, attending balls and soirees where sympathetic glances and speculative whispers followed her everywhere. She danced with gentlemen who now viewed her as available, as a lady whose expectations had been disappointed and who might therefore accept proposals she would previously have refused. She smiled until her face ached and pretended everything remained perfectly acceptable whilst dying incrementally inside. Her mother wept in private and maintained desperate optimism in public. Her father retreated back into his study with renewed dedication to the bottle. Her sisters offered useless comfort whilst Catherine sat frozen in the drawing room day after day, hoping for a call that never came, waiting for an explanation that never arrived. The Duke of Silvermere had vanished from her life as completely as though he had never existed. 10 days after his final note, Catherine gathered courage to send her own carefully worded inquiry to his London residence. The missive returned unopened with a verbal message from his butler that His Grace had departed town unexpectedly and would be unreachable for the foreseeable future. No indication of destination, no suggestion of when or if he might return, no acknowledgement that he had courted a lady with apparent serious intent before disappearing without explanation or farewell. The Tun responded with predictable cruelty that came disguised as sympathy. Morning callers arrived in droves, ostensibly to offer comfort, but actually seeking details for later gossip. Catherine received them all with brittle dignity, whilst her soul shriveled under the assault of their falsely concerned observations. Lady Pembroke, a notorious gossip with particular talent for delivering insults disguised as kindness, suggested perhaps the Duke had discovered something objectionable about Catherine's character or circumstances that had necessitated his withdrawal. Mrs. Hartwell wondered aloud whether Catherine had presumed too much, pushed too hard with inappropriate expectations, frightened away a gentleman who valued his freedom. Lord Marchmount's elderly mother observed that dukes rarely married significantly beneath their station, regardless of temporary infatuation, that Catherine should have known better than to encourage hopes that could never reach fruition. Each comment landed like a physical blow. Catherine smiled and thanked them for their concern and assured them she remained perfectly well whilst everything inside her turned to ash. The season limped toward its conclusion, with Catherine attending every event to which she had been invited, refusing to grant the gossip satisfaction of seeing her retreat into wounded isolation. She danced with gentlemen who pitied her. She conversed with ladies who whispered about her the moment she turned away. She endured her mother's thinly disguised despair, her father's renewed collapse, her sister's confused sympathy. In August, when the Tun dispersed to their country estates to escape London's oppressive heat, the Willowmores retreated to Lincolnshire with their humiliation intact and their financial situation more desperate than ever. Without the expected ducal alliance, their creditors grew aggressive. Final demands arrived with increasing frequency. The townhouse would need to be let to generate income they desperately required. The Lincolnshire estate faced possible sale to satisfy debts that could no longer be deferred. Catherine spent the journey north, staring out the carriage window at passing countryside and wondering how she had been so thoroughly, completely wrong about everything that had mattered most. She had believed Edmund sincere. She had trusted his apparent attachment. She had allowed herself to hope that perhaps Providence had not entirely abandoned her family. She had been a fool of the first order, and now everyone would pay for her foolishness. The Lincolnshire estate greeted them with tangible evidence of their decline. The air no longer smelled of London jasmine and beeswax, but rather of damp and peeling paint. When she touched the stair banister, the dust from the neglected garden seemed to deposit her family's failure onto her fingertips. Tenants approached with complaints about needed repairs that could not be funded. The steward presented accounts that revealed losses mounting with each passing quarter. Catherine's father retreated to his study and did not emerge save for meals he barely touched. Her mother took to her bed with various ailments, both real and imagined, unable to face the reality of their situation. Her sisters looked to Catherine for reassurance she could not provide. She understood with perfect clarity that the burden of their survival had fallen entirely upon her shoulders. Her father had abdicated responsibility. Her mother had surrendered to invalidism. Marianne and Eleanor were too young to manage anything beyond basic household tasks. If the family was to survive, Catherine would need to save them herself. She began by meeting with the steward, a capable man named Thornby, who had served the estate for decades and who regarded her initial attempts at involvement with skepticism that gradually transformed into respect. Catherine studied the accounts with attention her expensive education had not prepared her for, but determination supplied. She learned about crop rotation and livestock breeding and drainage systems. She consulted with neighboring landowners who initially dismissed her but eventually recognized her intelligence and willingness to learn. She discovered she possessed aptitude for practical management that years of preparation for matrimonial market had left entirely undeveloped. She could analyze problems, identify solutions, make difficult decisions about resource allocation. She could speak with tenants about their concerns and negotiate with tradesmen about necessary purchases. She could manage the household with efficiency her mother had never achieved. She transformed herself from decorative daughter, awaiting rescue through marriage, into functional administrator capable of preventing complete collapse. Her hands, once soft and pale with aristocratic uselessness, developed calluses from practical work. Her mind, previously occupied with fashion and social obligations, filled with knowledge of grain prices and tenant welfare and agricultural innovation. She became someone she barely recognized, harder, colder, infinitely more capable, and infinitely less hopeful about anything beyond immediate survival. The autumn of 1818 passed into winter with Catherine buried in estate management and her family's gradually stabilizing situation. She had negotiated extensions with the most aggressive creditors by demonstrating competent oversight and realistic plans for improving the estate's income. She had implemented reforms that reduced expenses whilst improving tenant conditions. Happier tenants worked harder and paid rents more reliably. She had discovered she possessed talent for the practical work of stewardship that her expensive education had never acknowledged might prove necessary. By Christmas, they had achieved precarious stability. The immediate threat of complete ruin had receded, though they remained far from secure. Catherine continued her work with systematic determination, finding some measure of satisfaction in accomplishment, even as the emotional devastation of Edmund's abandonment continued to poison her thoughts during unguarded moments. She received one letter from him during those months. It arrived in October, delivered by private courier rather than regular post, a detail that suggested he wished to avoid potential interception. The missive was brief to the point of cruelty. He apologized for his sudden departure, stated that circumstances beyond his control had required his absence, assured her that his regard for her remained undiminished despite appearances, and begged her forbearance whilst matters resolved themselves. Catherine read the letter once with hands that trembled despite her best efforts at composure. Then she carried it to the library fireplace and fed it to the flames. She did not reply, not out of mere resentment, but from a calculated coldness she had learned to value. Words would not save her family. Only actions, and his had been insufficient. Winter gave way to spring, with Catherine continuing her work and gradually accepting that her life would follow a trajectory entirely different from what she had imagined. She would not marry. She would remain at the Lincolnshire estate, managing affairs her father could not. She would ensure her sisters received modest presentations to local society rather than London seasons, hoping they might secure decent marriages to country gentlemen. She would live quietly, usefully, and without the dangerous vulnerability that love required. She had learned her lesson thoroughly. Hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. In April, her sister Marianne became engaged to Thomas Fairfax, the second son of a prosperous squire whose family estate bordered theirs. The match lacked the brilliance Marianne might have achieved had circumstances differed, but Thomas was kind and genuinely attached, and Marianne seemed content with a future that promised affection, if not grandeur. Catherine attended their modest wedding in May with genuine happiness for her sister, tempered by awareness of how different things might have been had Edmund kept his implicit promises. Summer arrived with Catherine settling into routines that had become comfortable through repetition. She rose early to meet with Thornby about estate business, She spent mornings reviewing accounts and correspondence. Afternoons she devoted to tenant visits or household management. Evenings she spent with her family, reading aloud or playing cards, maintaining some semblance of normal family life despite their reduced circumstances. She rarely thought about London anymore. She certainly never thought about the Duke of Silvermere. That, at least, was the fiction she maintained even to herself. In truth, Edmund haunted her thoughts during unguarded moments, when she passed the spot in the garden where she had first received flowers he sent, when she heard music that reminded her of their waltzes, when she encountered anything beautiful that made her wish instinctively to share it with someone who had proven himself unworthy of such sharing. She hated him for what he had done to her. She hated herself more for being unable to stop loving him despite everything. By autumn, Catherine had achieved something approaching peace, if not happiness. Her father's health had declined precipitously. Years of drinking had extracted their inevitable toll. The Earl spent most days in his chamber, cared for by servants, and visited briefly by family members who could do nothing to arrest his deterioration. In February of 1819, he died quietly in his sleep, his liver finally surrendering to decades of abuse. Catherine organized the funeral with efficient competence that had become her characteristic mode. When the physician pronounced the Earl deceased, Catherine's only immediate thought was the cold awareness that the title passed to a distant cousin. She immediately concentrated on inventorying the study to ensure nothing valuable was neglected in the transition. She accepted condolences from neighbors who had watched the family's decline with varying degrees of sympathy. She assumed her father's remaining responsibilities with the grim awareness that she had been functioning as de facto Earl for months already. The title passed to a distant cousin who showed no interest in claiming the encumbered estate. Catherine continued managing affairs with the cousin's tacit permission, grateful he did not interfere, whilst she worked to improve circumstances sufficiently that her mother and Eleanor might live comfortably. By the time autumn arrived again, marking a full year since Edmund's disappearance from her life, Catherine had transformed into someone new. She had learned to live without hope, without expectation, without the dangerous vulnerability that attachment required. She managed the estate competently, cared for her family adequately, and felt nothing much at all beyond distant satisfaction of meeting obligations. She was 23 years old and felt ancient. When the letter arrived in late November from Lady Westhaven, the Duke of Silvermere's great-aunt, whom Catherine had met briefly during that disastrous season, requesting her presence in London for the winter, Catherine's initial instinct was immediate refusal. She had no desire to return to the site of her humiliation, no interest in subjecting herself to renewed speculation and gossip. London represented everything painful she had successfully put behind her. Yet the offer included substantial financial inducement that could not be easily dismissed. Lady Westhaven proposed compensating Catherine generously for her time and trouble, framing it as payment for companionship during the winter months. The sum mentioned would complete the settling of her father's remaining debts and provide modest dowries for Eleanor's eventual presentation. The Dowager Duchess offered residence in her Berkeley Square home and assured invitations to all significant events. Catherine recognized charity disguised as employment, yet pride could not triumph over practicality when her family's welfare hung in balance. She accepted with the cold calculation of someone who no longer allowed emotion to dictate decisions. She arrived in London in mid-January of 1820 to discover the Dowager Duchess's true motivation. Lady Westhaven wanted intelligence regarding her great-nephew's activities, and she wanted Catherine specifically to provide it. The Duke of Silvermere had returned to London the previous week after his mysterious year-long absence. He had brought with him a female companion, the widowed Duchess of Linford, a striking woman in her late 20s, with connections to half the peerage and a reputation for acquiring wealthy protectors. She accompanied Edmund everywhere, their apparent intimacy suggesting a relationship that transcended mere friendship. The ton buzzed with speculation about an impending engagement announcement. Lady Westhaven believed her great-nephew was being manipulated by a scheming fortune hunter. She suspected the Duchess of Linford pursued him for his title and wealth rather than genuine affection. She wanted Catherine to observe them, report findings, and potentially intervene if suspicions proved correct. Catherine listened to all of this with the detached interest of someone watching a theatrical performance in which she no longer held any role. The Duke of Silvermere's romantic entanglements were no longer her concern. If he wished to marry a scheming widow, that represented his choice and his mistake to make. She owed him nothing, not loyalty, not concern, and certainly not rescue from his own poor judgment. Yet she agreed to Lady Westhaven's request because the old woman was paying her, and Catherine had learned to be entirely practical about such matters. Her first public appearance occurred at the Countess of Ridgeway's ball, an event that traditionally opened the winter season for those who returned to town after Christmas in the country. Catherine dressed with deliberate care in a gown of deep burgundy silk that Lady Westhaven had insisted on purchasing, far finer than anything Catherine had worn during her previous season. Her hair had been dressed in a severe style that emphasized her cheekbones and the cool distance that now lived permanently in her gray eyes. She wore no jewelry save her mother's pearl earrings, the one piece they had not been forced to sell. She entered the ballroom on Lady Westhaven's arm and felt every eye in the assembly turn toward them with gratifying speed. Whispers erupted immediately, spreading through the crowd like wildfire through dry grass. Lady Catherine Willowmore had returned to London. The Duke of Silvermere's abandoned sweetheart had emerged from rural exile looking positively transformed, harder, colder, and somehow more striking for it. Catherine scanned the crowd with deliberate slowness, allowing everyone present to observe that she had changed fundamentally from the eager girl who had fled London in disgrace 18 months prior. Then her gaze found him. Edmund stood near the orchestra with the Duchess of Linford clinging to his arm with possessive intimacy. He had changed little in physical appearance, perhaps a few more gray hairs at his temples, a few more lines etched around his eyes, but something essential had altered in his bearing. He looked haunted in a way that transcended mere fatigue, as though the year had extracted costs that went beyond the merely physical. Their eyes met across the crowded ballroom, and Catherine watched recognition and shock flash across his features with savage satisfaction. She saw him straighten as though struck, saw his lips part as though to speak, despite the considerable distance between them. The Duchess of Linford tightened her grip on his arm possessively and said something that drew his attention back to her with visible effort. Catherine held his gaze for precisely 3 deliberate heartbeats, allowing him to see exactly how much she had changed, how little his regard now meant to her. Then she turned away with calculated indifference and allowed Lady Westhaven to introduce her to Lord Howard, a pleasant gentleman seeking dance partners. Throughout the evening, Catherine felt Edmund's attention like a physical weight pressing against her from across the room. She danced with various partners, conversed with old acquaintances who seemed genuinely surprised by her transformation, and maintained perfect composure whilst her former suitor watched from his position beside the Duchess with increasing desperation that she noted with grim pleasure. She did not speak to him. She did not acknowledge his presence beyond that initial moment of eye contact. She treated him with the same polite disregard one might show a distant acquaintance of no particular importance or interest. By the time Lady Westhaven indicated readiness to depart well past midnight, Catherine had successfully established her new position in society's consciousness. She was no longer the heartbroken girl the Duke of Silvermere had abandoned so callously. She had become someone harder, colder, infinitely less accessible, someone who had survived his cruelty and emerged stronger for it. Let him wonder what she thought. Let him regret what he had destroyed. Let him suffer the uncertainty she had endured for 12 endless months. She discovered she possessed capacity for vindictiveness she had not previously known existed within her character, and she found the discovery neither troubling nor unpleasant. Edmund began his campaign of attempted reconciliation the following morning with a massive arrangement of white roses delivered to Lady Westhaven's residence before breakfast had concluded. Catherine examined the flowers with clinical detachment, noted they were indeed beautiful, and instructed the footman to return them to the sender with a politely worded note stating she could not accept gifts from gentlemen to whom she was neither related nor engaged. He responded by calling at precisely 3 o'clock, the traditional hour for morning calls despite the misnomer, only to be informed by Lady Westhaven's supremely competent butler that Lady Catherine was not at home to visitors. This was technically accurate, as Catherine had left the house at 2:30, specifically to avoid any possibility of encountering him. This pattern continued with stubborn persistence on both sides. Flowers arrived daily and were returned with equal regularity. Calling cards accumulated in the silver tray in Lady Westhaven's entrance hall, each bearing Edmund's increasingly desperate messages requesting the honor of a few moments of her time. Notes arrived requesting her presence at various events or begging for opportunity to explain circumstances that had necessitated his behavior. Catherine ignored them all with systematic determination that bordered on the obsessive. She attended every significant social gathering, always arriving on the arm of Lady Westhaven or one of the respectable gentlemen the Dowager Duchess delighted in introducing as potential suitors. A fiction they all maintained, despite understanding Catherine had no intention of marrying anyone. She danced with numerous partners, laughed at appropriate moments with genuine amusement she had not felt in months, and maintained the performance that Edmund Ashford, Duke of Silvermere, meant absolutely nothing to her whatsoever. Meanwhile, the Duchess of Linford pursued her own campaign with equal determination and considerably less subtlety. The widow accompanied Edmund everywhere with possessive intimacy that suggested established rights and prior claims. She made pointed comments within Catherine's hearing about their close friendship, about time spent together during his absence from London, about understanding between them that transcended mere acquaintance and approached something far more significant. The ton watched this drama unfold with gleeful attention worthy of the most entertaining theatrical production. Betting books at White's and Brooks's recorded new wagers regarding the Duke's ultimate choice. Would he return to his first love, or would he marry the sophisticated widow who had consoled him during his mysterious absence from society? Catherine maintained her indifference with iron discipline, even as curiosity gnawed at her carefully constructed composure. Where had Edmund been that year? Why had he left without explanation? What precisely was his relationship with the Duchess of Linford, and did Catherine care enough to investigate despite her determination to remain aloof? Lady Westhaven provided partial answers during one of their private conversations in the Dowager Duchess's elegant sitting room overlooking Berkeley Square. The old woman revealed that Edmund had been pursuing a dangerous investigation related to his father's death 8 years prior. The previous Duke had not died accidentally in a carriage mishap, as authorities had concluded. He had been murdered. Edmund had spent the intervening year gathering evidence against the man responsible, and somehow the Duchess of Linford's late husband had been involved in the conspiracy. This information should have changed everything. It should have explained Edmund's behavior, justified his abandonment, transformed Catherine's anger into understanding and perhaps even sympathy for what he had endured. Instead, it only intensified her sense of betrayal that cut deeper than any knife wound. If he had trusted her, he could have explained before disappearing. If he had valued her opinion and autonomy, he would have found a way to maintain contact, even if only through coded messages. If he had respected her as an equal, rather than viewing her as a fragile ornament requiring protection, he would have allowed her to make informed decisions about risks she was willing to accept. His protection had become abandonment. His care had manifested as cruelty. His good intentions had devastated her life as thoroughly as deliberate malice might have done. She told Lady Westhaven as much during that conversation, her voice flat with the absence of emotion that characterized all her current interactions. The old woman studied her with shrewd eyes that had witnessed 8 decades of human foolishness and observed that forgiveness required courage Catherine might no longer possess. Perhaps Edmund's greatest crime had been teaching her to protect herself too effectively, building walls so high and thick that genuine connection could no longer penetrate them. Catherine did not dispute this assessment because it was entirely accurate. A week after her return to London, Catherine attended the opera with Lady Westhaven and several other ladies of respectable age and irreproachable reputation. During the interval, as she stood in the corridor outside their box examining the crush of society on display, Edmund appeared directly in her path with the determination of someone who had exhausted patience with polite approaches that yielded no results. The Duchess of Linford had gone to speak with friends, leaving him momentarily alone and clearly seizing the opportunity he had been seeking. He stepped close enough that propriety dictated she acknowledge him, close enough that his words would reach her ears alone without requiring him to raise his voice and attract attention from curious observers. He spoke rapidly, urgently, with desperation that might have moved her 18 months prior, but now merely irritated her. He explained that he needed to speak with her privately about matters of utmost importance. He insisted circumstances existed that she did not understand, that his actions had been driven by necessity rather than caprice. He begged for opportunity to explain everything if she would only grant him a few moments of her time away from public scrutiny and potential eavesdroppers. Catherine listened to his plea with the expression of someone hearing moderately interesting information about a topic of limited personal relevance. When he finally fell silent, awaiting her response with visible anxiety, she informed him with glacial precision that his explanations arrived approximately 12 months too late to be of any conceivable use or interest. She suggested he return his attention to the Duchess of Linford, for she herself no longer had time for ghosts of the past. She walked away before he could respond, her hands trembling only slightly with the effort of maintaining composure when every instinct screamed to either strike him or collapse into tears. She did neither, returning to Lady Westhaven's box with her dignity intact and her heart racing with emotions she refused to examine too closely. The Dowager Duchess caught her arm once they had regained privacy and squeezed with surprising strength for a woman of her advanced years. She murmured that Catherine had done well, that Edmund deserved to suffer for his mistakes, but that suffering alone would not resolve anything between them. Eventually, Catherine would need to decide whether she possessed capacity to forgive or whether she would spend her life defined by what he had done to her rather than by who she chose to become, despite it. Catherine had no answer to this because she genuinely did not know which option represented truth. The season progressed with agonizing slowness, punctuated by increasingly uncomfortable encounters. Edmund abandoned subtlety in favor of direct confrontation wherever and whenever opportunity presented itself. He appeared at events she attended, despite the Duchess of Linford's obvious displeasure. He engineered situations that required interaction through manipulation of mutual acquaintances. He refused to accept her continued dismissal with the stubborn persistence of someone who had decided patience had failed and more aggressive tactics were required. Catherine continued her performance of indifference even as the strain of maintaining it exhausted her reserves. She attended every ball, every musical, every garden party to which invitations arrived. She danced with numerous gentlemen, including several who made their interest in potential courtship embarrassingly clear. She received proposals from a viscount with a pleasant estate in Kent, a baron with political aspirations, and a wealthy merchant's son who offered genuine affection, if not illustrious title. She refused them all with polite firmness because some wounds cut too deep to heal quickly enough for remarriage to represent anything beyond desperate escape from loneliness. Meanwhile, the Duchess of Linford responded to Edmund's pursuit of Catherine by increasing her own possessiveness to levels that bordered on theatrical. She created scenes designed to establish her prior claim and suggest existing understanding between them. During one particularly uncomfortable evening at Lady Sefton's musical, the widow cornered Catherine in the ladies' retiring room, whilst other women pretended not to listen with rapt attention to every word. The Duchess informed her with icy precision that Edmund and she shared an understanding forged during months of close companionship whilst pursuing justice for their respective losses. She suggested that Catherine's reappearance represented an unwelcome complication to plans already in motion toward inevitable conclusion. She advised Catherine with false concern to accept one of her other suitors and stop interfering in matters that no longer concerned her and had never truly involved her in the first place. Catherine responded with matching coldness that she had no interest whatsoever in the Duke of Silvermere's romantic entanglements, current or future. If he and the Duchess of Linford had reached an understanding, she wished them every happiness their union might provide. Her own presence in London had nothing to do with Edmund, and everything to do with Lady Westhaven's generous sponsorship and her own need for temporary change of scene after the isolation of rural Lincolnshire. She finished with cool conviction. "My presence concerns not Lord Silvermere, but my own need, paid for and hard-won, to be here. The past is yours, Duchess. My future is mine." The Duchess departed looking unsatisfied with this response, clearly having hoped to provoke more dramatic reaction. Catherine returned to the music room feeling oddly hollow, as though the confrontation had drained something essential from her already depleted reserves. That night, alone in her chamber at Lady Westhaven's residence, with only moonlight and silence for company, Catherine allowed herself to confront truth she had been avoiding with dedicated effort. She still loved Edmund Ashford despite everything. Despite the pain and humiliation and year of deliberate emotional death, some treacherous part of her heart remained attached to the man who had destroyed her capacity for trust. This realization did not soften her resolve or weaken her defenses. If anything, it strengthened her determination to protect herself at all costs. Love that had caused such devastation once would certainly do so again if given any opportunity. She would not make that mistake twice, regardless of what explanations he offered or how genuine his current remorse might appear. Yet neither could she maintain her current performance indefinitely without cost to her own well-being. The strain of constant vigilance exhausted her. She found herself lying awake through long nights, analyzing every encounter, reviewing every conversation, wondering if she should listen to his explanations or continue her calculated indifference until he finally accepted defeat and transferred his attentions permanently to the Duchess of Linford or some other lady willing to accept his apologies. Lady Westhaven observed her deteriorating composure with growing concern that manifested in increasingly pointed comments. Finally, one morning over breakfast in the sunny morning room, the Dowager Duchess set down her teacup with decisive firmness that indicated important pronouncement forthcoming. She informed Catherine that she had arranged a house party at her Hertfordshire estate for the following week. Edmund would attend, as would the Duchess of Linford and various other guests providing proper chaperonage and social camouflage. Catherine would attend as well, and she would finally allow Edmund to explain his actions in full without interruption or premature dismissal. After hearing everything, she could make an informed decision about whether forgiveness remained possible or whether the breach between them could never be adequately repaired. Catherine began to protest this high-handed arrangement, but Lady Westhaven silenced her with an imperious gesture perfected over 8 decades of expecting obedience from everyone around her, regardless of their own opinions. The old woman stated with absolute finality that she had not sponsored Catherine's return to London merely to watch 2 people she cared about destroy themselves through stubborn pride masquerading as principle. They would have this conversation whether Catherine wished it or not, and she would listen to what Edmund had to say with open mind rather than predetermined rejection. What she did with that information afterwards remained entirely her choice, but she would at least be making an informed choice rather than one based on incomplete understanding and justified but potentially excessive anger. Catherine recognized when she had been thoroughly outmaneuvered by someone with far more experience in manipulation. She agreed with notably poor grace and spent the following week in mounting anxiety about the confrontation ahead. The conversation that might change everything, or might simply confirm that some things, once broken, could never be adequately repaired. 80 Westhaven's estate in Hertfordshire sprawled across acres of manicured grounds that spoke of centuries of careful stewardship and considerable wealth. The house itself dated from Queen Elizabeth's time, all mullioned windows and Tudor chimneys, modernized internally whilst retaining historical character that lent dignity to the sprawling structure. Catherine arrived on a grey Friday afternoon to discover she had been assigned chambers in the East Wing with views across the deer park, where a small herd grazed picturesquely beneath ancient oaks. The other guests assembled for dinner that evening included Edmund and the Duchess of Linford, as promised, along with several couples Catherine recognized from London society. Respectable people whose presence provided proper chaperonage whilst ensuring the gathering maintained appropriate social character. The atmosphere crackled with barely suppressed tension as everyone navigated the awkwardness of the situation with varying degrees of success. The Duchess of Linford had positioned herself beside Edmund at dinner with the territorial determination of someone establishing boundaries. She maintained a stream of conversation that suggested intimate knowledge of his preferences and habits accumulated over significant time spent in close proximity. Catherine sat several places distant, between a pleasant elderly baron with hearing difficulties and a young gentleman newly returned from the grand tour who spoke incessantly about Italian architecture. She participated in conversation with apparent ease, whilst hyper-aware of Edmund's frequent glances in her direction, glances she steadfastly refused to acknowledge or return. After dinner, when the ladies withdrew to the drawing room in accordance with custom, the Duchess of Linford wasted no time in establishing territorial claims through performative intimacy. She settled herself at the pianoforte and played with considerable skill that could not be dismissed as mere adequate accomplishment. She explained to the assembled ladies that Edmund particularly enjoyed this Scarlatti sonata and had requested she perform it often during their time together in Leicestershire whilst pursuing the investigation that had consumed his attention. Catherine absorbed this information with outward indifference whilst her stomach clenched painfully. So the Duchess had been with Edmund during his absence, had shared his daily life whilst Catherine suffered in ignorant isolation. Whatever investigation he had pursued it with this woman at his side, sharing confidences and presumably developing the intimacy she now displayed so obviously. Lady Westhaven caught her eye from across the room and gave an almost imperceptible headshake, as though warning her not to draw premature conclusions from insufficient evidence. When the gentlemen rejoined them after their port and masculine conversation, Edmund immediately crossed to where Catherine stood, examining a display of Ming porcelain arranged on elegant shelves. He positioned himself beside her with the determination of someone who would not be deterred by social niceties or her obvious preference for his absence. He spoke in a low voice, meant only for her hearing, requesting that she walk with him in the morning. He promised he would explain everything if she would only grant him that opportunity. He stated that he understood her anger and her justified hurt, but begged her to at least hear the full truth before finalizing her judgment against him permanently. Catherine studied the porcelain figure in her hands, a delicate shepherdess with a lamb, and considered her limited options. She could refuse and maintain her protective distance indefinitely, or she could grant him this audience and finally learn what had driven him away, what truths he believed would justify actions that had devastated her so completely. She agreed to meet him in the Rose Garden at 9 o'clock the following morning, then turned away before he could express gratitude or relief that might weaken her resolve. That night, Catherine slept poorly, despite the comfortable bed and quiet surroundings, her mind racing with possibilities and fears about what morning might reveal. What could he possibly say that would justify his actions? What truth could transform abandonment into something forgivable rather than merely explicable? Morning arrived gray and cool with threatening rain that matched her mood perfectly. Catherine dressed in a simple walking dress of moss green that Lady Westhaven had commissioned from a fashionable modiste, and made her way to the Rose Garden at precisely the appointed hour. Edmund was already there, pacing among the dormant bushes with barely contained energy that suggested he had been waiting considerably longer than necessary. When he saw her approaching along the gravel path, his entire countenance transformed with relief and something approaching desperate joy. He closed the distance between them in 3 long strides, then stopped abruptly as though suddenly remembering he had forfeited all rights to touch her or approach without explicit permission. They stood facing each other in the quiet garden, with only birdsong and distant sounds of the estate waking to break the silence, and Edmund began to speak with words that tumbled out in urgent confession. He told her everything, without reservation or protective editing. He explained that his father had been murdered 8 years prior by a man named Cornelius Whitmore, a distant cousin who stood to inherit significant properties if the Duke and his line died without legitimate issue. Whitmore had arranged what appeared to be a carriage accident on a remote road, and for years everyone had accepted that tragic explanation because questioning it served no purpose beyond causing additional pain. But Edmund had always harbored doubts born of small inconsistencies and his intimate knowledge of his father's habits. 3 months into their courtship, just when Edmund had been planning to formally request Catherine's hand, new evidence had emerged, confirming his worst suspicions. The Duchess of Linford's late husband had been Whitmore's closest associate and had possessed documents proving the conspiracy. When the previous Duke of Linford died suddenly, possibly murdered by Whitmore to prevent his confession or blackmail, those incriminating papers had passed to his widow. She had contacted Edmund with her suspicions and offer of alliance. Together, they had spent the year gathering evidence sufficient to bring Whitmore to justice through legal channels rather than merely private revenge. Edmund explained with visible distress that he had left London without explanation because Whitmore had discovered their courtship and had sent explicit threats. The villain had made clear through intermediaries that anyone Edmund cared about would become a target for elimination. Edmund had made the agonizing decision to disappear from Catherine's life completely, reasoning that if Whitmore believed the attachment severed, Catherine would remain safe from the danger Edmund's pursuit of justice had created. The Duchess of Linford had assisted him because she wanted justice for her husband's death and had her own reasons for seeing Whitmore convicted. Their apparent intimacy throughout the investigation and subsequent return to London was entirely fabricated performance designed to convince society, and therefore Whitmore's numerous spies, that Edmund had moved on from his previous attachment completely. In reality, the widow was desperately in love with a solicitor of modest means who had assisted with the legal aspects of their case. She planned to marry him once Whitmore was convicted, and she no longer needed to maintain aristocratic pretenses for investigative purposes. Edmund spoke for nearly an hour, whilst Catherine stood motionless, listening without interruption as he laid bare every detail. He showed her letters, documents, sworn statements from witnesses, evidence that supported his claims and demonstrated the genuine danger Whitmore had represented. He explained that Whitmore had been arrested 3 weeks prior based on the evidence they had painstakingly gathered. The villain currently awaited trial that would likely conclude in conviction and execution for murder and conspiracy. He confessed that he had written to her during those months, but had kept his communication brief and uninformative, fearing that detailed letters might be intercepted and either endanger her or provide Whitmore with information about the investigation's progress. He admitted that he should have found better ways to maintain contact, to explain his situation more fully, but at the time he had believed complete separation represented her best protection from danger he had inadvertently created. He told her that not a single day had passed without thinking of her, without regretting the pain his necessary choices had caused, without hoping that someday he might earn her forgiveness and the opportunity to resume what they had begun. When he finally fell silent, awaiting her response with visible anxiety that bordered on terror, Catherine stood frozen whilst her mind struggled to process everything she had heard. His story explained everything and changed everything, and yet somehow changed nothing that truly mattered. She asked the question that burned in her chest. Why had he not trusted her enough to confide in her initially? Why had he not allowed her to make her own informed choices about risks she was willing to accept? Why had he decided unilaterally what was best for her, rather than treating her as an equal partner, capable of understanding danger and choosing whether to face it alongside him, especially after she had proved her competence managing the estate. Edmund had no good answer beyond fear and desperation and protective instincts that had overridden better judgment. He admitted that he had acted paternalistically, that he had prioritized her physical safety over her emotional well-being and autonomy, that he had made terrible mistakes despite honorable intentions. He knew she had changed and that the girl he left behind would have asked for protection. But the woman who had managed the near ruin of an earldom demanded partnership. Catherine turned away from him and walked to the low stone wall that bordered the garden, overlooking the deer park where morning mist still clung to low-lying areas. She needed distance to think clearly, space to examine her feelings without his desperate blue eyes clouding her judgment and pulling at emotions she had worked so hard to bury. She understood now why he had left. She even understood intellectually that he had been trying to protect her from genuine danger that might have cost her life. But understanding did not automatically confer forgiveness. His choices had devastated her, had transformed her into someone harder and colder, had taught her that love meant vulnerability to unacceptable pain inflicted by those who claimed to care most. Could she forgive him? Did she want to try? Did she possess courage to risk her heart again on a man who had proven capable, despite excellent reasons, of inflicting such profound damage? Edmund remained where she had left him, neither pursuing nor retreating, simply waiting whilst she decided his fate and her own with decision that would shape both their futures permanently. Catherine stood at that wall for long minutes that felt like hours, watching deer graze peacefully in the distance whilst wrestling with the most important choice she would ever make. Love required trust, and Edmund had shattered her trust completely despite his justifications. Yet love also required understanding, and she now understood his motivations even if she could not fully accept his methods. She turned back to face him with decision made, though she was not entirely certain it was the correct one. She informed him that she appreciated his honesty and understood his reasoning. She acknowledged that he had faced an impossible situation with no perfect solutions available. But she also stated with unflinching directness that his protection had felt like abandonment, that his silence had wounded her as deeply as any physical threat Whitmore might have posed, that his unilateral decisions had treated her as a child requiring guardianship rather than an adult capable of assessing risks and making informed choices. She told him she needed time, not days or weeks, but real time to determine whether she possessed capacity to rebuild trust he had destroyed. She could not simply resume their courtship as though the intervening year had not occurred and had not fundamentally transformed them both. She had changed too profoundly, and he needed to understand and accept who she had become rather than assuming she remained the eager girl he had left behind. If he truly wished to earn her forgiveness and potentially resume what they had begun, he would need to demonstrate through sustained actions rather than temporary words that he valued her as an equal partner capable of facing danger alongside him rather than a fragile ornament requiring protection at all costs. Edmund agreed immediately with visible relief that she had not rejected him outright. He promised whatever time she required, whatever proof she demanded. He stated that he would wait years if necessary, would prove himself daily through actions large and small, would never again make significant decisions affecting her welfare without consulting her first and respecting whatever conclusions she reached. Catherine did not entirely trust these promises because words came easily whilst consistent action over time represented far more difficult commitment. But she recognized sincerity in his voice and desperation in his eyes that suggested he understood how thoroughly he had failed her and genuinely wished to do better. She extended her hand formally across the space between them, and after a moment's hesitation, Edmund took it with the reverent care of someone handling something infinitely precious and infinitely fragile. They shook hands like business partners negotiating terms of complex agreement, and somehow this felt more honest than any romantic gesture might have in the circumstances. It represented a beginning, though what they might ultimately build from this foundation remained entirely uncertain. The house party continued for another week, during which Catherine observed Edmund with new eyes sharpened by understanding, but not yet softened by forgiveness. She watched how he interacted with other guests, courteous without being obsequious, attentive without being intrusive. She noted his treatment of servants, speaking to them as people rather than mere functionaries. She observed moments when shadows crossed his features, evidence of the year's toll on his spirit and conscience. The Duchess of Linford, upon learning that her performance was no longer necessary, dropped the possessive act entirely and revealed herself as a surprisingly pleasant woman with sharp wit and genuine affection for Edmund as a friend rather than romantic interest. She sought Catherine out privately to apologize for the deception and confirm everything Edmund had explained. The widow revealed that Edmund had been miserable throughout their fabricated association, speaking of Catherine constantly and nearly abandoning the entire investigation multiple times because separation from her had become unbearable. This information provided cold comfort, but at least confirmed Edmund's suffering had matched her own. When the house party concluded, Catherine returned to London with Lady Westhaven, whilst Edmund departed for Leicestershire. They had agreed he would not call upon her in town, that she needed space without his constant presence to determine her true feelings, independent of the attraction that still existed between them despite everything. They would correspond, brief letters discussing neutral topics that allowed them to rebuild communication without the pressure of courtship. He would provide regular updates on Whitmore's trial. She would inform him of her plans and activities. They would proceed slowly, carefully, with no assumptions about ultimate outcomes. February brought Whitmore's trial, which concluded exactly as expected with conviction on all charges. The villain would hang before spring arrived. Edmund wrote to Catherine describing the proceedings with unflinching honesty, including his own complicated feelings about watching justice served for his father's murder, whilst recognizing that vengeance brought less satisfaction than he had anticipated. Catherine attended the trial's final day, sitting in the gallery and watching the man whose villainy had indirectly destroyed her happiness receive his deserved punishment. Afterwards, as she and Edmund stood outside the Old Bailey amidst crowds discussing the verdict, he thanked her for coming. He stated that her presence had transformed the moment from hollow victory into something meaningful, that having her beside him, even without formal reconciliation, mattered more than he could adequately express. Catherine acknowledged his gratitude with a small smile, the first genuine one she had granted him since their reunion. Perhaps they were making progress after all. In March, Edmund invited her to visit Silvermere Hall in Leicestershire. Lady Westhaven would accompany them as chaperone along with several other respectable guests. He hoped Catherine might judge whether she could imagine herself mistress of such an establishment, whether she could envision a future there. Catherine agreed, recognizing this invitation represented a test for them both. The estate revealed itself as they progressed up a long drive, golden stone glowing in afternoon sun, windows reflecting clouds, grounds maintained with obvious care and affection. The household staff greeted them with warmth that suggested Edmund inspired genuine loyalty rather than mere fearful obedience. During the week that followed, Catherine witnessed Edmund in his natural environment. She accompanied him on visits to tenant farms, where he discussed agriculture with knowledge born of genuine interest and investment. She watched him interact with his steward, a capable man named Thornby, who clearly respected his employer, whilst feeling free to argue when they disagreed about management decisions. One afternoon, she found him in the library, spectacles resting low on his nose as he studied an old estate ledger, a simple domestic moment that revealed the conscientious man beneath the ducal formality. This glimpse of quiet normalcy, devoid of the theatricality of London, disarmed her more than any grand gesture. She observed his inspection of the estate school he had established for tenants' children, his genuine interest in their progress, his immediate authorization of funds for additional books and supplies. She accompanied him to the home of an elderly widow whose cottage required repairs, watching as he made detailed notes and promised specific action on specific timelines. She saw him as he truly was. Not the London gentleman or the desperate suitor, but the conscientious landowner who took his responsibilities seriously and measured success in tenant welfare rather than mere profit extraction. One afternoon during a walk through the homewood, Catherine asked directly about the shadows she still saw crossing his features during unguarded moments. Edmund admitted that pursuing Whitmore had required him to witness terrible things and enter dangerous situations that had left marks that might never fully heal. He would carry those memories always, but was trying to make peace with them. Catherine appreciated his honesty and recognized in it the equality of partnership she had demanded. He trusted her enough to reveal vulnerability rather than maintaining facade of invulnerability. On their final evening at Silvermere Hall, Edmund arranged a private dinner in the smaller dining room overlooking the lake. Lady Westhaven had tactfully declined to join them, claiming rheumatism required early retirement. They ate mostly in comfortable silence, then walked in the moonlit garden to a stone bench overlooking still water. Edmund spoke carefully, choosing words with obvious thought. He told her that this past year of cautious rebuilding had been simultaneously the most difficult and most rewarding of his life. Difficult because he had been forced to confront the magnitude of his mistakes and work daily to overcome her justified distrust. Rewarding because watching her strength and resilience had only deepened his regard beyond what he had felt during their initial courtship. He stated that he loved the woman she had become even more than he had loved the girl she had been. Her practical competence, her refusal to accept easy reassurances, her determination to maintain autonomy, these qualities made her not just desirable, but essential to him. He acknowledged he could not erase the past or undo the pain he had caused. He could only promise that if she granted him the honor of her hand, he would spend every remaining day proving himself worthy of her trust through actions rather than mere words. He would never again make important decisions without her input and full participation. He would treat her as the capable partner she had proven herself to be rather than as treasure requiring protection. Edmund withdrew a small velvet box from his pocket and opened it to reveal a ring. Not an ostentatious diamond, but a simpler gold band set with 3 stones, an emerald flanked by pearls. He explained that the emerald had been his mother's, the pearls his grandmother's, and he had combined them into something new, just as he hoped they might create something new together from the broken pieces of their first courtship. He asked if she would marry him. Catherine stared at the ring glowing softly in the moonlight, whilst her heart performed complicated acrobatics in her chest. Every rational part of her mind catalogued reasons for refusal. Yet another part of her, quieter but infinitely more persistent, whispered different truths. Love required courage as well as caution. Forgiveness demanded strength rather than weakness. She realized that she had already made her decision, perhaps weeks ago when he had first explained everything at Lady Westhaven's house party. The intervening time had simply been her heart catching up to what her mind already knew with certainty. She told Edmund yes. His relief manifested as something between a laugh and a sob. He stood and drew her to her feet with trembling hands, then slipped the ring onto her finger with reverent care. It fit perfectly, as though it had been made for her. Edmund asked permission before he kissed her, and she granted it with a smile that felt rusty from disuse, but genuine nonetheless. The first contact was a delicate question, tentative and uncertain. As the kiss deepened, Catherine felt the familiar roughness of his hand at her waist, but this time it was tempered by the hard-won understanding that had been forged in pain. It felt like 2 halves, long separated, learning with infinite care how to rejoin and function as a whole. When they finally separated, both breathing unevenly, Edmund rested his forehead against hers and spoke in a voice rough with emotion. He promised he would spend every day earning the trust she was granting him, that he would never again fail her so catastrophically, that she had made him the happiest and most grateful man in England. Catherine replied that marriage was partnership, not debt. They would build their future together, learning from past mistakes rather than being imprisoned by them. She would hold him to his promises, and he would hold her accountable as well. They would face difficulties as equals rather than protector and protected. Edmund agreed with fervent conviction, and they sealed this new understanding with another kiss that felt like benediction. The wedding took place in June at the church on the Silvermere estate, a small ceremony attended by family and close friends, rather than the elaborate society spectacle such a match might typically warrant. Catherine had insisted on simplicity, and Edmund had agreed to everything she requested with an eagerness that would have been amusing had it not been so sincere. Marianne and her husband attended from Lincolnshire, along with Eleanor, who had blossomed into a serious young woman with literary aspirations. Lady Westhaven sat in the front pew, looking supremely satisfied with her machinations. The Duchess of Linford attended with her solicitor fiancé. They would wed themselves the following month, and Catherine had promised to attend that ceremony as well. Catherine wore ivory silk trimmed with Brussels lace, her mother's pearls at her throat, and Edmund's ring on her finger. As she walked down the aisle toward where Edmund waited with barely controlled emotion visible on his usually composed features, she felt no doubt, no hesitation, only certainty that she had made the correct choice despite how circuitous and painful their path had been. The vows they exchanged were traditional, but Catherine heard additional promises beneath the formal words. Edmund's voice trembled slightly when he pledged his troth, revealing depths of feeling usually concealed beneath ducal composure. Her own voice remained steady as she made promises she fully intended to keep, having learned that words meant nothing without consistent action to support them. When the vicar pronounced them married, Edmund kissed her with tenderness that suggested reverence as much as passion. Catherine felt tears prick her eyes and did not try to prevent them falling. These were earned tears, honest tears, tears that acknowledged both pain endured and joy reclaimed. They emerged from the church into brilliant sunshine and a shower of flower petals thrown by local children who had been given the afternoon free from their lessons for the celebration. The wedding breakfast featured simple country fare prepared by the Silvermere kitchens, and Catherine found herself enjoying it more than any elaborate London dinner she had attended during those desperate seasons. During the toasts, Edmund stood and spoke briefly, but with obvious sincerity. He thanked everyone for attending, acknowledged his great-aunt's heavy-handed machinations with affectionate exasperation that made Lady Westhaven laugh delightedly, and turned to Catherine. He stated simply that she had given him far more than he deserved, and he would spend his life ensuring she never regretted the leap of faith she had taken in accepting him despite his failures. Catherine rose and responded that marriage was partnership between equals, not debt owed by one to another. They would build their future together, stumbling occasionally, but always returning to the foundation of honesty and mutual respect they had established through such difficulty. The past had taught them valuable lessons about communication and trust, lessons that would serve them well if they remembered to apply them consistently. The guests applauded, and Catherine saw more than one lady dabbing at tears whilst gentlemen cleared throats suspiciously. As the celebration continued into evening, Catherine found herself surrounded by well-wishers and genuine happiness that felt almost foreign after so many months of carefully maintained emotional distance. She watched Edmund across the room speaking with Thornby about some estate matter even on his wedding day, and felt her heart expand with affection for this complicated, flawed, ultimately good man who had hurt her terribly, but who had also worked harder than anyone she had ever known to earn her forgiveness. Later, as night fell and guests began departing for accommodations in the village or nearby estates, Edmund found her in the garden, where she had stepped out for fresh air and momentary solitude. He approached quietly and stood beside her in companionable silence, their shoulders barely touching. He asked if she was happy, his voice uncertain in a way that revealed lingering fear that she might still harbor regrets despite everything. Catherine considered the question seriously before answering. She told him that happiness felt both more complicated and more substantial than she had imagined as a girl anticipating her first season. She had learned that it included not just joy, but also struggle overcome, not just passion, but also partnership, not just romance, but also respect hard-won through honest confrontation of failures and consistent effort toward improvement. She was happy, she confirmed. Perhaps not in the simple, uncomplicated way she had once imagined happiness might feel, but in a deeper, more durable way that suggested their foundation could weather future storms because it had been built on reality rather than fantasy. Edmund drew her into his arms with visible relief, and Catherine allowed herself to rest against his chest whilst listening to the steady beat of his heart beneath expensive fabric and complicated emotion. And so another tale of hearts united reaches its blessed conclusion. Love, it seems, finds a way even through the strictest conventions of proper society, even through betrayal and abandonment and pain that seemed insurmountable. For Catherine Willowmore, now Catherine Ashford, Duchess of Silvermere, had learned that the strongest foundations are built not in the easy beginning, but in the difficult middle, when all illusions have shattered and only truth remains. She had learned that forgiveness is not weakness, but the bravest act of all, requiring one to risk again what was once destroyed. And she had learned that the love worth having is not the love that causes no pain, but the love that survives pain and emerges transformed. Harder perhaps, but infinitely more valuable for having been tested in the crucible of real human failing and real human effort toward redemption. Their story would continue through years of partnership, through children born and estates managed and occasional arguments resolved, through the honest communication they had learned to value above all else. But on this June evening, as stars emerged above Silvermere Hall and a new duchess stood in her husband's arms, contemplating a future that had seemed impossible 18 months prior, it was enough to know that love had triumphed, not easily, not simply, but completely and with a depth that shallow happiness could never have achieved.